Hello, everyone, and welcome to, I guess this is technically episode 4 of Silver Screen Anomalies, because the last episode was...
No, it's episode 5.
All right, fine. We'll go with episode 5. Welcome to episode 5 of Silver Screen Anomalies. I'm Hallie.
I'm Skyler.
And as usual, today we are bringing you 2 movies that are totally unrelated to one another.
Yeah, this is actually going to be a weird change of pace for us, because normally we do movies that are like... somewhat similar. These movies absolutely have nothing in common.
So different.
Nothing in common at all.
Not at all. Not even a little bit. We're not fooling anyone, are we?
Did they? Well, at this point, they probably would have looked at, the graphics that we made.
Oh, right, those. All right. Well, with that said, let's get right into it then.
Yeah, so we're doing a little bit of like a special edition episode here. We wanted to cover, with the release of It Chapter 2, we really wanted to cover both movies and felt like it was necessary to cover both movies as they sort of encapsulate one singular story, and it just felt inappropriate to cover anything else other than Chapter 1 along with the release of Chapter 2.
It's true. And we're also recording in a new location, so if you happen to hear
A screaming cat.
something that sounds like a raspy meow in the background, just ignore it. It's just the co-host.
It's not a senior citizen with a chain smoking addiction dating back to like the 40s. No,
It's a cat.
That's my cat. He will make noise. Prepare yourselves.
Hopefully at the best times. So, It Chapter 1.
Yeah, so that's the first movie on the docket. Here's the synopses. It Chapter 1, directed by Andy Muschietti. Based on the hugely popular novel by Stephen King, co-written by none other than Cocaine. A group of young kids from a small mysterious town named Derry, Maine, must face their greatest fears as a cosmic shape-shifting killer clown named Pennywise tries to add them to the body count of murdered children.
And that body count's pretty high.
It's very high because apparently this thing's been around a long time.
It's been around for a while, yeah.
Centuries, as
That's
it turns
what they
out.
say, yeah.
Okay, so it's obviously a movie that's been out since 2017 and garnered a tremendous amount of attention and success as a result of a box office performance that was not too dissimilar from like a Marvel film in a lot of ways, which is great for the horror community in a lot of ways.
This isn't the first iteration of It that's been done for the screen.
Oh, God, do we want to talk about that right now?
Very, very briefly, I think.
Okay, fine. We'll leave a small little Cliff Notes version of the original miniseries of It just at the beginning of this to get it out of the way, because I really don't want to talk about it for
It was
very long.
awful. I mean, with the exception of
Tim Curry is
yeah.
great. Everything else in the miniseries is just terrible.
Just terrible.
Really hokey, cheap special effects. The kids are fine, and then the adults suck. The end.
So, to speak to this version of It,
Yeah.
miles better.
Good Lord, yes.
Not even in the same category.
So with this iteration in It Chapter 1, they actually did something really intelligent, which was, I don't know, for those of you who don't know how the book is structured, and like Hallie, to kind of speak to our backgrounds, have you read the book?
I think I did a long, long time ago.
Oh, trust me, you would remember if you read the book.
I remember certain things from the book, let's put it that way.
If you hit someone with this book, they will die. It is
it is a massive
It's
book.
1,200 pages long. It's a nightmare, and I kind of love it and also scratch my head at it. It's a mixed bag of like brilliant and also confusing ideas. And that really kind of summarizes in a lot of ways my feelings on both of these movies, but we'll get more into that later. With It Chapter 1 though, in terms of like the story and the plot, they did something really brilliant here, which was they took all of the perspective of the children was actually isolated into one film. Now, for those of you who don't know, this book actually is a non-linear story. A big part of the messaging in this book is memory and also childhood trauma. And the way that King actually presents this in the book is through the angle of like it's constantly shifting back and forth between adult and child perspectives. Now, oh my God, my cat is screaming.
He just wants your attention.
I hope you can hear that. So in this particular iteration, in Chapter 1, the
He just wants to be a podcaster too, Skyler.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Okay. In this particular chapter, the children are the main focus in this first movie, which I think is brilliant because in the age of Stranger Things and this 80s resurgence, which also is something to bring up because in the novel for this film, it was set in the 50s with the children's portion of the novel. In this particular movie, it is in 89. So right on the cusp of like the Batman movie has come out, and like Nightmare on Elm Street 5 is rampant in the theaters and things like that. They capitalize off of the era perfectly, and also the nostalgia wave of 80s content.
We seem to touch on that 80s resurgence a lot lately because it's showing up a lot lately.
It seems to pop up an awful lot, and like until it annoys the shit out of me, I'm not going to complain about it.
No, neither am I.
Because I don't hate it. I kind of love it. I'm not going to lie.
Me too. I'm going to ride this current trend until it, you know,
you could say I'm part of the problem, but like if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing. And I kind of like it. It's good content. So right out the gate, when we talk about it, I feel like we can't discuss this movie without first talking about the opening of this movie, which was an eye-opener for me because right away I knew I was going to enjoy this film because of vicious child murder.
Yeah, there was so much child death in this movie. Oh my
God, poor Georgie.
They did not hold anything back on that one, did they?
Didn't pull any punches. I remember reading that section in the book and it actually scaring me when I was a kid when I read it. Probably read that a little too early perhaps. But needless to say, they didn't pull any of the gory punches and went right for the jugular with how graphic that sequence is written in the book, and didn't shy away from showing a dismembered child
rolling around on the street in the rain.
Yeah.
Until it gets dragged in supposedly by a clown.
Gangly clown arm. Yeah, it's some good shit. That's what I'm saying.
I have to say, I really appreciated how streamlined this story was in chapter 1. I do remember reading the book, and I do remember that it is broken by chapters, multiple chapters between the children and the adults. But I really appreciated how streamlined this was. This was all about the kids. It's all about the past. And then the next one is all about the future.
Totally. If anything, the second chapter is very much focused on the future and also recalling the past. It's very much a movie about trauma and how one deals with trauma. While this movie is childhood trauma, but in a different manner where it's more about adolescence. It's about growing up and the fear of becoming an adult in a lot of ways. It's very much like that isolated, almost like deep-seated fear that one feels when they're younger and they feel age setting in and like they're growing up. Pennywise, the dancing clown, is a representation in a lot of ways of childhood fears and how that manifests into a reality and how like these children deal with that and grow stronger as a group.
Yeah.
And I think as a singular movie, It Chapter 1 is a strong piece of cinema. I think
it really is,
not just a horror film, but also it's a good movie. It's really entertaining. I've watched this movie in preparation for both seeing It Chapter 2 and then also just for my own pure enjoyment. I think I've seen this movie 5 or 6 times now since it's come out in 2017.
And now it's on Netflix, so it's even easier to watch.
Yeah, and like I willingly did this. This wasn't a thing where like I was drugged to the theater more than once to see this or anything like that. I actually saw this movie twice in the theater during its theatrical run, and I enjoyed every second of it. I actually thoroughly enjoyed this. And granted, it's not perfect. It's not slightly beveled on all edges or anything like that. There's definitely some issues which we'll cover. But I think as a piece of entertainment, it's solid across the board.
Yeah. You know, the story in this, the narration, the characters, everything in this was actually from a narrative structure. Really sound. It was really sound. I really appreciated it. I thought it was really good. And one of the things I loved about it was delving into the history of Derry and explaining this town's, like, I guess, ambivalence to all these murders and missing children. Like, yeah, the parents are distraught, but I mean, people just carry on with their lives instead of being out there all the time and going, why are all these kids dying? Why are all these people missing?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, to be honest, that's some of the more interesting things to cover in the book as well. Like the book, and I mean, I promise I'm not going to like constantly reference the novel in this
That's
podcast
right.
because
it's about movies.
We have to separate it.
That's right.
But when you have something that is an adaptation of a property,
it's the source material.
It's a source material. You have to reference it. There's no escaping it. Can you watch this separately and take it as a separate experience? Absolutely. So as a movie, I'm looking at this as beats, essentially. Like, I'm looking for all of the beats. And as a horror film, it works really well because it's almost like a roller coaster where there's almost sequences set up directly to scare audiences in large droves. And this is something that works especially well, I think, in this chapter as opposed to the second chapter, which we'll cover later in
the second part of this podcast.
So for the first chapter, I think one of the things that I enjoyed about this is how effective it is as a horror film, because I do think that there's a lot that's done in this that's actually quite brilliant in terms of direction, design, the way the story presents itself, where it spends time with these kids you get to really pay attention to and really care about these kids, and subsequently you fear for their death.
Yeah, you worry about them.
Yeah.
They definitely flesh them out. Like, from a story perspective, I mean, each of these kids has to face a fear.
That's right.
I mean, that's the whole gimmick with Pennywise.
It's about facing your fears in a lot of ways.
It's about facing your fears, and each of them has a very unique fear, but it's unique for children.
Yes.
Which is really good. Like, the character Stanley is afraid of the painting. It's a weird painting, but it's a painting. But as a kid, you're like, oh, that's really a weird
That's
painting.
a very rational fear to have. Because if you look at this painting in the film, that's something that would upset me when I was his age. Like,
exactly.
It's not pleasant to look at.
But as an adult, you wouldn't look at it. You'd be like, oh, that's kind of wonky.
Yeah, and they utilize it effectively in the film. It's one of the lesser effects, in my opinion, because there's a comment to be made about like the use of CGI in this movie as well. Like,
and we'll get to that too.
Absolutely. But like, as a storytelling device, the first chunk of this movie, and you don't notice it on the first watch, but you definitely do on subsequent watches, the first chunk of this movie is very much just like, it's almost like a roller coaster where like you're going through a path and there are things specifically set up to scare you. Each subsequent scene is a new nightmare, essentially. And they use it effectively because they want to use it as a method to not only scare the audience, but also introduce the children. And there's something to be said about the two iterations of this movie, or the two, I guess, depictions of this movie in a weird way, because if you watch this movie in one way, it's actually a really great coming of age film with these like really likable, wonderfully performed like child actors. Like, every single one of these kids is great.
Oh yeah, they're not a weak
so
link among
good.
them.
Like, every single one of them, every single one of these characters is likable. They all have their own tics. They're multidimensional.
Yep.
And then this asshole clown comes out of nowhere and ruins everything. Like, it's
but let's talk about this asshole clown.
Okay, yeah. So, elephant in the room here. We mentioned this earlier with the miniseries that obviously Tim Curry
did a great job as Pennywise. I enjoyed him as Pennywise.
A lot of what people remember about that miniseries and why they might hold it dear to their hearts is actually the performance of Tim Curry and less the movie itself, or the miniseries. But like, Bill Skarsgård comes to bat, and he's
cracks
terrific.
It out of the field.
He's terrific.
I think, and I learned this from the interwebs, is that moment at the beginning of the film where you first see Pennywise.
Yep.
And he's talking to Georgie, and his eye goes slightly off in one direction.
Ugh.
When I learned that that's actually something Bill Skarsgård can do, no disrespect, I never want to meet him. That's terrifying.
That shit's crazy. Like,
could you imagine the shit you could get up to?
There's absolutely. Like, that's a good party trick, really.
It's a great party trick, and also a really good way to weird out your friends.
Yeah.
But he did an amazing job as Pennywise.
Well, especially because he does his own take on the character. He's not emulating Tim Curry at all.
No.
If anything, I actually would dare say that he's probably a bit more of an authentic representation of the way Pennywise is depicted in the book. I'm going to cover this a little more in chapter 2 because it'll make more sense. But there's actually like a chapter in this book that is from the perspective of it. Oh. And I think Skarsgård's portrayal almost emulates that perfectly.
Yeah.
It's like he's on the cusp of breaking out of a disguise constantly.
Yeah.
Right from the very beginning. Like, he does a really good job of, like, I mean, first of all, if anyone sees like a creepy clown in the sewer, no one's going to go anywhere near that.
Except the kid.
Except the kid, right? Like, they're going to be curious about it, and he's got his boat or whatever. But like, it's the fact that he does such a poor job of keeping up the mystique of the clown. Like, he does a really good job of luring Georgie in, and then he breaks. There's like a moment where
he
like,
always has that though. It's perfect. It's like he can emulate humans, sort of. Like 60% he can get them right, and then that last 40 he
falls apart.
It falls apart, and it's beautiful every time you see it.
I love it.
You know what? Yeah. It goes back to something we've talked about in previous episodes. It's Uncanny Valley. He is a clown, but there's something off about him, and you don't really realize there's something off about him until that reaches that 60% mark.
The wall breaks down essentially of like, he pauses mid-sentence, there's drool dripping from his face. Like, all these things too are like, a lot of these were ad-libbed by Bill Skarsgård as well. Like the whole concept of like the performance notes of like him just drooling with the eye thing and everything. It's so upsetting. He really embodies this performance and does such a great job making this creature like feel like a clown when it needs to feel like a clown, but also breaking that mold and shape-shifting constantly, because it really doesn't know how to hold its mystique for very long.
No. I mean, it's almost like it relies on that first few minutes, you know, to get to its prey.
Totally. And I mean, you could criticize it, and I know a lot of people do, that like the whole idea or the concept of Pennywise loving to depict itself as a clown is because it would use the clown to lure in the kids. But if I'm being perfectly honest, I don't think that that's a valid criticism, because clowns are fucking creepy. Like,
they kind of are.
No clown is going to lure me in. When I was a kid, I don't care what you look like. If that's I'm not into clowns. Like,
no, I'm not. I'm not a fan of clowns.
Yeah, so right out the gate, make it a spooky clown. I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
Clowns are in. They're popular now.
Yeah.
So with the remainder of the plot, it very much follows like a very like almost coming of age formula in a lot of ways, because there's a grand chunk of this movie that, even though it's set in a very specific place in Maine, that's at a very specific time where like this town has almost got that sort of like close-minded mentality. There's some subtle racism and things like that are thrown in.
Subtle?
More subtle than the book.
Oh, well, that's fair. I can't recall the book well enough.
Yeah, but... good Lord. They actually dialed it back. I was kind of surprised. But homophobic, racist, lots of like sprinklings of like 80s sort of, I mean, hell, like not even 80s, because, you know, like people still talk like this, I guess. But like, it feels very Stephen King in authenticity, but there's this charm to everything. The way the kids are depicted and the way these performances are carried. And really, like, I don't think there's any one standout performance necessarily, because all the kids have a role to play and they do such a good job. If I had to pick one, personally, I really like Sophia Lillis as Beverly Marsh a lot.
She was really good.
I actually think if this kid keeps going the way that she is, like, she's going to knock this thing out of the park. Like, she's so talented.
She really was.
There's like a way that she like carries herself, and that subtle wink that she gives to Ben, and just like there's a charisma about her that I really adore. And I think that she's going to go places.
I can't tell if it's because I am so attached to Stranger Things or not, but Finn Wolfhard.
Oh my God. He steals. He literally steals. He steals every scene he's in.
Oh, he's just brilliant. I hear they had a hard time getting him to stop swearing after the filming.
I'm not surprised.
I'm not either. That kid swore a lot in that movie.
Yeah, he's kind of the scene stealer and also the comedic levity in the film, and one of the more well-realized characters, as it turns out, and this really bleeds into the second chapter quite a lot. Like, there's a lot to actually unpack, I think, with Richie.
Yeah, his character has a lot going on that you don't really necessarily pick up on in the first movie.
That's right.
So, but we'll get to that in the second part.
Totally. Yeah. Absolutely.
I really enjoyed all of the characters in this.
Oh, yeah.
They were all like, bravo, kids. You did fantastic.
Wonderfully realized. The movie does a good job of balancing comedy and the scares. Like, I didn't find in this particular movie that the comedy and the horror like juxtaposed against each other. Like, I felt like they were very balanced.
They were really balanced, whereas in previous reviews that we've done, they haven't hit the mark. And I'm looking at you, Godzilla King of the Monsters.
Oh my God.
The humor in this one just worked.
Yeah.
It worked it wove itself into the dialogue
it's
well.
Organic. It integrates well, and like they use Richie Tozier's character when they need to use him. Like, he almost breaks the tension a little bit. Like, the audience is noticeably like uncomfortable with certain sequences, and then Richie will come in and actually like sort of like break the tension a little bit, and not in a bad way where you're like almost like lulled into it. You want to be with the kids in, like, for example, the sequence that comes to mind. That set for the house, when they enter that house,
house is just a nightmare.
Yeah, the Neibolt house.
Yeah.
I love that thing. I think it's such a cool looking set piece, and they enter this thing, and it's just a nightmare right from the start. And just the fact that it is Eddie Kaspbrak and Richie Tozier and Bill that go into the house first, and it's just the three of them sort of like trying to make sense of this thing and try to go through this and confront this horrible monster that they don't even have a clue how to deal with.
Did you like the Room of Clowns? I thought the Room of Clowns was a nice touch.
Oh yeah, why not layer clowns on top of clowns?
More clowns. You know what this movie needs? More clowns.
Yeah.
MOAR.
It was
more.
upsetting, and just like the performance by Bill Skarsgård in this, like, he's so manic and just like drooling all over the place. When he unravels himself out of the fridge, and he's just like, I can't describe it. It's almost bordering on overacting, but like you buy it.
Yeah.
He's like lulling his way towards Eddie, faking sick, and just like trying to like scare the shit out of this kid who's got his arm broken like all the wrong ways.
Oh yeah, no, that is unpleasant. Oof.
Yeah, there's just so many sequences in this first chapter that like I go back to and I think, and I'm just like, that's a great scene, and that's a great scene.
Yeah.
Like I love, one of my favorite scenes in any movie that year in 2017 has to be the kids all gathering together to clean up a copious amount of blood out of that bathroom.
That's a lot of blood.
To a song by The Cure. I loved it. It
that
was just
was
so
really
fun.
nice. That was it was a good bonding experience for everybody.
Yeah.
Now there is one kid that we haven't really touched on, and I feel like we should, because although he is an antagonist in the movie, you also feel a little sympathetic to him.
Tiny bit.
A little bit. Very little, because he's still an asshole.
He's psychotic.
He is. And kudos to the actor who played him, because that was something else. But the character of Henry Bowers.
Yeah. The bully.
The bully character, who's just all kinds of trash. But
He's so aggressive and so upsetting, but you feel just a tiny bit bad for him, especially when you see how he interacts with his father.
And I think that's it. You know, this is arguably a movie about kids coming to terms with their fears. And in a way, Henry Bowers is the exact opposite of that, where he doesn't really like confront his fear, which is like his father, as much as he embraces Pennywise.
Yeah.
You know, he becomes a catalyst or an agent of Pennywise.
Yeah, he's used for violence.
He is. You feel a little bad for him, though, because obviously he's also a victim.
Yeah.
Just of his father.
Yeah, and there's a lot of thematic elements in this that correlate directly back to just this small town mentality, child upbringing, the depiction of all of the adults in this film. Like, they can actually kind of enter a contest to see who's the shittiest parent, because
God, there are a lot of them.
They're all bad.
They really are.
We haven't even talked about Beverly's father, who might be the worst.
Do we have to?
Yeah, let's avoid that.
I don't know if I can handle that.
No,
There's just so many things to unpack with that, and none of them are good.
It's a level of greasy that I can't.
It is a box that is dripping, and I don't want to open it.
No, it's bad.
But again, kudos to the actor, because...
Oh, yeah, no. Everyone is great in this.
Yeah, there's not an actor that did a bad job. The characters are either lovable or detestable, and that's what you want.
Yeah. So that pretty much, like, without going into like heavy spoilers anyway, like that kind of covers really like the story and the characters.
Yeah.
I really want to talk about direction. Andy Muschietti, I'm in love with this guy. I actually think so. A little bit of like trivia there. Like Andy Muschietti comes from, he was kind of put under the wing of Guillermo del Toro, my boy, and that was on the film Mama. Now, Andy Muschietti really showcases a sense of style in his direction in this movie, because there's a lot of really great sequences that you can tell, like, there's a love for the source material here. That's the one, and that's why, like, I really feel okay about bringing the book up in this particular review. Normally, I don't like to do this, but it's very clear that Andy Muschietti referenced the book a lot in both of these films, because there's an affinity for detail, there's an affinity and a passion for capturing the best angle of this very ambitious horror novel as possible. Like, he really wants to tell the best story that he can, and with chapter 1 he absolutely succeeds, because he takes all of the best parts in that book and strings it together and makes something that is actually incredibly entertaining. And on a set design and direction level, it's gorgeous to look at. Yeah. What are your thoughts on, I guess, the effects and the set design?
You know, I really liked a lot of the set design, a lot of the set.
Were there any gags that stood out to you? Were there anything that, like, really, like, I mean, we talked about Georgie getting his arm ripped off, of course.
We did talk about that. Yeah.
Stanley's fear of the painting.
The painting was really unnerving.
Yeah. I think the painting is most effective, actually, at the end, where, like, the kids stumble onto Stanley almost getting devoured.
Okay, yeah, that was terrifying.
Yeah.
Like, okay, it's one thing to have a creepy lady in a painting whose face is kind of warped. It's another to give her the teeth that Pennywise has in his monstery mouth.
I love that effect, actually. It's almost like a mandible, like a deep sea creature, almost.
Yeah, it did. Or some sort of weird plant monster.
Yeah, like a Venus flytrap type thing.
Yeah, something.
I'll tell you the set piece that really stood out to me.
It might be the same one that just popped into my head, but go ahead.
Is it the finale?
It is the finale. Yeah, the under the sewers, that mountain of discarded toys and relics.
I loved that.
It was awesome. And having all of these dead children floating in the air,
literally floating, was
brilliant.
Yeah.
I loved it.
And that's a departure from the source material too, and stylistically I actually think it was kind of gorgeous to look at, because it immediately you look at that thing and it tells a story. It tells basically the audience how long this creature has been terrorizing this very mysterious town,
and how many children have succumbed to it. Because looking at that amalgamation of all these broken artifacts, pieces of clothing, toys, each one was connected to a kid in my mind. Anyway.
Yes, absolutely.
And that, when you look at how tall that pile of crap was, that's a lot of kids. That's a lot of people that it's eaten and consumed over these
and
centuries.
it's a great way to end your and basically end your film on this spectacle level, because this movie is not a short film. Like, it's pushing the 2-hour limit, which is not common for horror films. And
honestly, it's not that much compared to the second movie.
I don't even want to talk about that just yet.
Oh, we will.
So when it comes to that, actually, it's interesting to speak to that, because I think this is the perfect setting for your climax in a lot of ways, because this giant stack of, I guess, debris over history and time of this creature's existence in this town is a great way to end this film, because it winds up being like a really good climax where, like, the kids battle it out with and defeat the monster by gathering together, and it leads to emotional beats, which is something we haven't talked about, because a big part of why this movie is so effective is that it basically triggers emotions on all cylinders. It's horror, it's comedy, and then on top of that, it's tragedy. And Bill embracing and accepting the death of his brother actually made me cry the first time I saw this.
Yeah, that was heart-wrenching.
And they all, like, hug him and stuff. Like, it's a lot. And
because, I mean, up until that point, I think he was almost holding out hope.
He was, absolutely,
that Georgie was alive. But seeing, what was it, the rain slicker?
Yeah. And Georgie's name tag on the inside.
Yeah. And that's the final straw. There is no denying.
Yeah.
Georgie's gone. The emotional roller coaster in this film is really, we didn't touch on it too much, but there is a whole nother level to it. And the bond that these kids share.
Yeah. You can feel it. It's like it's a friendship that is unbroken. It's a friendship that's long lasting. And
it's a friendship that's solidified at the very end of the movie where they create this pact, which I do remember from the book.
Do you mean they didn't do the child orgy?
Which I am so grateful for.
Oh, you didn't want to see that?
No, I did not.
Yeah, nobody wanted to see that.
No.
Yeah.
So I'm really
so glad.
I'm really glad that they went with the blood pact that they did.
Look, Stephen King, I know you did a lot of blow in the 80s. I understand. It's fine. You got to stop defending this scene, man. Like it's not okay. You could have done this very tactfully, like the film did. The whole blood pact idea is actually a much more effective method to tell the exact same story with these characters than that very lewd sequence in the book.
Yeah, glad we didn't have to deal with that. Oh, we've got disruptions. Cat disruptions. Oh, God.
I just had to wrangle my cat. If you're wondering why there's a gap.
That we had to do some cat wrangling. And by we, I mean Skyler.
I literally had to fight my cat from damaging our equipment.
He just wants to be a podcaster.
I hope you appreciate this, audience.
So anyway, I guess let's, without further ado, why don't we get to the scores?
Absolutely.
All right. Skyler, do you want to go first?
I guess I can do that.
Why not?
So I think this movie works just about on all cylinders. The only exception to this, because we didn't really touch on criticisms, we were too busy gushing. And it's easy to do that, I find, with Chapter 1, because
there's a lot to gush about.
There's a reason why this movie made as much money as it did, because it's not just nostalgia, it's also just a really effective and very entertaining movie, notwithstanding the genre that it's in.
Even if you hadn't read the book. And again, I don't remember the book that well. I remember certain things, but not a lot. It's a great movie. Like, it's a solid piece of cinema.
Yeah, absolutely. And the only thing I will say about it that kind of undercuts a lot of what it does is the use of jump scares. On subsequent watches, it doesn't bother me a ton, but there are a lot of uses of like in sound design and overuse of jump scares. It can feel a little tiresome where like a lot of the scares are undercut by a loud noise. And I find that to be a little obnoxious, where basically the sound is scaring you instead of what you're actually seeing. It winds up actually kind of in a weird way escaping this criticism because a lot of the visuals that you're seeing are kind of upsetting. So it winds up undercutting a lot of the issues that I have. Like even though on like when you watch it an awful lot, it can really like leave a sting. So like it's not a perfect film, but it's damn close. And I think it's super entertaining. I think it's something that you can just throw for a horror fan. You can just throw it on and really get immersed into, like, I find I can't just put this movie on and not finish it. It gets a 9 out of 10 for me.
Oh my God, it got a 9 out of 10 from me too.
No way.
True story. This was a very streamlined narrative. I loved the story. I loved the characters. Everything from start to finish, I was entertained. I was not aware of time passing. I was not aware that I was watching a movie. I had a few issues with just not really anything serious. So it's a 9 out of 10 for me. I enjoyed this movie. This was a good movie.
Yeah, I agree on all sentiments. I think it's solid across the board. So why don't we talk about Chapter 2?
Why don't we, Skyler?
Chapter 2 just released the beginning of September and has garnered an awful lot of attention, box office attention especially. So we felt like it was a very appropriate time to talk about this movie, and there certainly is an awful lot to talk about, isn't there?
There really is. This movie was not quite the same as the first one. I mean, not just in story, but in structure.
You could say that the first film had structure.
I could, and I think, you know what, Skyler, I think I would.
This film is a hot mess. It's all over the place.
It kind of is, yeah. Like,
this is a very unfocused movie in a lot of ways. There's a lot of attention in terms of like narrative structure that is more catered to the way the book is structured. And I think a topic of discussion that we do need to discuss is obviously the book with this particular movie. Unlike the first one, I feel like the first one, you can get away with focusing on it as a singular story, but this particular movie is not something that is going to, like, it really doesn't hold your hand at all. Like, it expects you to almost be familiarized with the material. And in the very least, you need to see the first movie to actually fully understand this one.
Yes and no, because in a way where the first movie addressed only the children, this one should have addressed only the adults, but they actually like cut in sections with the children versions of themselves that weren't in the first movie.
Absolutely.
Which to me kind of says you're angling for a part of the audience that maybe hasn't seen It Chapter 1. And I feel like you shouldn't do that if, you know, you're doing Chapter 1 and Chapter 2.
See, I actually don't think it's that at all. I think the choice to put the children in this movie was because the first movie made like $700 million at the box office.
That's a valid point, yeah. Actually,
it's the children are incredibly talented. People love those kids.
Oh yeah. I mean, we raved about them.
Absolutely. They've since gone on to do other projects. And I mean, one of them, like Finn Wolfhard, is obviously on Stranger Things. It would be, from a marketing standpoint, it would be a total logic error to not include the kids because of the popularization of the first movie. I feel like it's totally a marketing thing and not a story-driven thing. And
well,
also,
that's the problem, right? You can tell it's not story-driven. And
yeah, that's the point I was going to make, was that this whole experience doesn't feel nearly as organic as the first. It feels more like it's a less congealed story. It's more actually focused on the same story structure as the book, where the book is non-linear. It jumps from timeline to timeline and you piece it together. That's very much what this movie is like. The story follows the adults who have now gone on to live their lives. The only one who has stayed in Derry is Mike, and he's become sort of a historian in a way for the town, and focused entirely on the creature, Pennywise to be exact, and figuring out its patterns and its patterns of violence. And to speak to the patterns of violence, we need to discuss something that's a giant elephant in the room, which is the controversy surrounding this movie. And I mean, you and I definitely have some opinions on this.
Yeah.
So I'll just open this up, and then I'm going to let you go on this one, Hallie, to start and get your opinion on this.
Yeah.
So for the audience, and again, we are a spoiler podcast, so
rife with spoilers.
We are going to spoil the shit out of this movie. So this movie opens with a very controversial scene. It's a controversial scene in the book as well, and I feel like in today's very sensitive climate, even more so. Basically, it opens with a homophobic crime, a violent act, very violent, where a man is brutally beaten on a bridge and thrown into a canal or river, and is subsequently mauled and eaten by a killer clown. It is a sequence of events, to say the least, and it's certainly an eye-opener for this opening a movie, I guess. Like, it's very much a bit jarring.
Yeah, it was too much.
Which is saying something, considering the first film opens with child dismemberment.
It's true. And somehow that disturbed me less. I was right off the bat so uncomfortable. And I mean, you should be uncomfortable seeing that.
Absolutely.
That said, I felt it was too long and too vivid, too violent. I don't know. I didn't care much for that opening sequence. I understand its importance. I understand that it's in the story, but that was brutal to a point that it set a tone for me for the rest of the movie that I couldn't shake. I don't know what else to say about that. It was too much for me. I feel like they could have cut it down. If you wanted to keep that kind of violence in the movie, that kind of hate crime in the movie, if you're going to do it, don't draw it out. It felt drawn out to me, and I was just uncomfortable.
Totally. First of all, to go off of what you're saying, I actually completely agree. And to speak to that, I think the reason why I wanted to bring this scene up first, A, because it's a point of controversy, and B, because I feel like it actually, in a weird way, ties in with a lot of this movie's major issues, which is they're completely stuck and confined to the writings of Stephen King. And it's not to criticize this book, so I want to put it out there that I actually really like this book a lot. It left a mark on me growing up. I think it's a conglomerate mess in a lot of ways, but it has a ton of genius ideas in it. It's a bit of like a hodgepodge, and I mean, like I jokingly said in the beginning of this podcast, it's co-written by Cocaine, obviously Stephen King. A little bit of substance influence on this one, you can tell. But that being said, it doesn't make it any lesser of a product. It's obviously revered and has been for a very long time for a reason, because there's some really, really great stuff in here. That being said, this intro to this movie is ripped right out of the book. And you kind of have to put a little bit of the blame on the original source material in a way, because Andy Muschietti has been doing a very good job of trying to adapt this material as closely to the book as possible. And you could tell that there's a passion and an admiration to his devotion to the source material and wanting to capture it to the best of its ability. A lot of this movie's issues are completely stuck on the source material. To speak to the scene in general, just isolated on its own, I agree. I actually feel like they went too far, because I feel like there's another way to shoot this scene without seeing a man's face getting punched in, if that makes sense. Like, because there's like, you hear every blood curdling, bone crunching sound. Like, it is so alarming and so jarring.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was the choices made there. And I mean, you do have to hang a lot of that on the direction, because choices were made to make that scene really leave an impact. And it did, but not in like, it puts a really bad taste in your mouth.
It really does. And I mean, I can't imagine watching that as somebody who is homosexual.
No.
Like, I can't imagine what somebody like that would
feel bad for anyone that relates to that on that level. It's a level of discomfort that shakes the foundations of the rest of the movie. And since this movie is so goddamn long, it's like
so long.
Too long. I can't imagine relating to that, like on that particular level, and then having to suffer through the rest of this movie as a result, because it really does stick with you. It stuck with me.
Yeah, it stuck with me.
And to play devil's advocate for just a moment, because I do think that there's a little bit of a dissection, because we just both established this scene could have been cut down or even reduced or even not included at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it exists. It's in the movie. So let's talk about it from a dissection standpoint, and we'll try to keep it as brief as possible. But I feel like when it comes to this particular scene, I think it's setting a tone. And I feel like from a direction standpoint, what they were trying to accomplish was establishing right away that Pennywise is now threatening adults. It's changing the game. It's basically like, oh, this is a very real, very near to our hearts crime. And this is a point of violence that is very relevant today. And it was trying to set the tone for the rest of the movie, where we are now dealing with adult characters who are dealing with the same threat that they acknowledged as a child. It's about this movie very much is about childhood trauma and coming to grips with it, accepting it, and then overcoming it. So I think from a direction standpoint, they certainly achieved that with this scene, but I feel like it could have been watered down or done in a way that was a bit more tasteful.
Yeah, I think something you mentioned too is that Pennywise is drawn to these hate crimes.
Yes.
So in the past, there was a race crime as well, was there not? Is that what
in the book? Yeah. So, and that's actually a really good point, is that it's established in the source material that Pennywise resurfaces every 27 years at the surface or wake of a major violent act. There's an explosion that kills a bunch of kids. There's a race crime at a bar with a fire, and then following that, of course, is the homophobic crime. And that's written in the book. It's very much a Stephen King sort of acknowledging these crimes as a resurfacing of evil almost in humans or mankind. And it very much is like a representation of that in a weird way. It's almost like the negative energy in us. So again, like, it goes back to what I was saying with my opening statement, that a lot of the weight kind of has to be put on the source material here, because it's all coming from the book, despite the choices made in direction. I feel like personally they could have cut this scene right out of the movie.
I would have preferred having it cut out of the movie, honestly.
Yeah.
It made me angry too.
Sure.
Even now, talking about it,
because there's no
justice.
Just
get angry.
Yeah, there's no justice for
There is
anything.
no justice. And that's what bothers me. A, that it happens. B, that it happens in small towns. And I mean, that's Derry. Derry is always, it's established in chapter 1. Residents of Derry look away.
And it feels so disconnected from the rest of the movie, because even the violence from Pennywise on the riverbed feels different than the rest of the movie. It feels...
It's more blatant.
It is. There's a bluntness to it.
Yeah, he's not hiding what he is. He's blatantly eating somebody in
plain sight. And even like the detail there, like where he goes for the armpit, that's in the book too. Like, so I mean, I have to, on one hand, like commend Andy Muschietti's direction in detail, where he's actually really capturing every moment for what it is, but it's a detail that I feel like could have been changed, especially where there are things that are taken directly out of the book that make no sense to me that actually would have added some context. So that brings us to the characters in the movie, because I feel like there's no way to discuss the remainder of the plot without actually talking about the characters in tangent with the plot, because this movie is a character-driven film.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Losers Club returns to Derry, and then they have to then go find totems. They're going to try and stop Pennywise. That's the big thing. Everybody's come home because Pennywise is resurfaced. Mike contacts them. Everybody comes home except for one.
Which I actually think is a very well done scene. It
is. I feel kind of bad, though, that, he didn't get a bigger part in the movie.
Yeah, me too. Stanley is obviously the elephant in the room here. Like Stanley, just like in the book, he kills himself.
Yeah, he does not come home to Derry.
At the mere mentioning of Pennywise being a threat again, he just can't.
He just kills himself.
Yeah, there's suicide in this movie. There's
a lot of trigger warnings for this movie.
Yeah, like you're not in a safe place with this one. It's a bit upsetting. But anyway, the remainder of the Losers Club return to Derry, prepared. Well, I mean, the thing is, first of all, Mike doesn't tell them why they're coming back, which leads to some comedy. The comedy in this movie is effective, and mostly at the hand of Bill Hader. Bill Hader is awesome.
Bill Hader is great. Like, not just his acting, his character. The character of Richie is great. Amazing on so many levels.
Yeah, there's a lot of dimension added to each of the characters in this film, but Richie especially gets some appropriate attention. And Bill Hader's performance, he elicits all of the emotional content in this movie. Basically anything that you feel in this movie almost directly comes from him. And the comedy that I spoke of is equal parts a compliment and a huge problem with this movie.
Yeah, where comedy worked in the first one, this chapter did not have a good comedic flow to it.
Not at all, because in the first film, we mentioned it in our first section to this podcast, that that movie felt very balanced. It felt like a nice harmonization of both horror and levity. This does not. This movie did not work for me as a horror film, which I'm just going to go out and say it. This is the major issue I have with this movie beyond everything else, is that it doesn't function as a horror film.
No, it doesn't. And that's unfortunate, because that's kind of what I went there for.
It's what it needs to be.
Yeah, and it's a horror story.
It needs those scares. It needs those big grandiose moments, but every single one of them is undercut by basically a dramatic or comedic sting that feels very ill-placed. Mostly a comedic sting. So many moments are ruined by comedy in this movie.
Yeah.
Where I'm laughing and it ruins the scare. It ruins the emotions. It ruins the drama. For example, okay, so all of the losers come back, and you also discover that the Henry Bowers, childhood bully, is also still alive. Somehow he survived that. That brutal fall down that well. Oh my God.
He gets splashed out into the river with a bunch of corpses.
I remember watching it chapter 1 and seeing him fall down that well, and he hits his head or something on the side of the well, and I'm like, he is dead.
Yeah, there's no way he should be surviving that, but I don't know, I guess Pennywise?
I guess.
Shoulder shrug?
Perhaps. But Henry Bowers survives and is used as a tool by Pennywise to attack the Losers Club. Now,
with his buddy cop that died in the first movie. There is a scene where Henry Bowers escapes from the mental asylum that he's been in for the last 27 years. And outside in a car, an old hot rod of some kind, is his buddy who died in the first film. And he just hops in and he's like, yeah, let's go. And it's just like a scene out of a buddy cop film.
It felt like it was ripped right out of another movie from the 80s or something. It was so bizarre. And
I'm
not going to lie, I kind of want to see that movie, but not in It Chapter 2.
Yeah.
So he's going on a wild...
Live cop, dead cop.
Yeah.
It's a great sitcom right there.
But again, it's that undercutting again, where that scene felt so out of place and so strange. There's so much of that in this movie, and it doesn't help that the movie isn't focused either, so it never has a moment to breathe. You're constantly jumping back and forth in time. It's hard to keep track of the timeline and what it's trying to do, because sometimes the adult versions of the characters that we know will enter a location, especially on the hunt for the totems, and it'll be represented by the child actor. And I'm like, there's no warning, there's no edit to signal signal that this is back in time or this is a memory. They're rebuilding their memories in a lot of ways. That's what the totems are for. And you need to clearly label where these scenes are so the audience doesn't get disconnected. I was constantly disconnected in this movie.
Aside from the fact that it is 3 hours long and it was painful to sit through for that long.
Oh, it's an ass-numbing 3 hours long. Like, it's not like an Avengers Endgame where, like, there's so much to latch on. The pacing's really well structured and everything feels entertaining, like it's exciting, and you don't, the 3 hours just breezes by. This movie did not breeze by.
No, and I think that the reason it didn't breeze by is because we were broken out of the trance.
Totally.
Out of that movie-going trance by, let's call them little hiccups.
Yeah.
That were big hiccups in some spots.
Huge, yeah.
Paul Bunyan-sized hiccups in certain spots. I'm sorry, man. That scene just, I don't know.
It sucks.
It does. There's a scene where Richie is trying to find his totem and he goes out into the park and there's a giant Paul Bunyan statue there. And then the statue comes to life.
And it's in broad daylight. And I'm sorry, any movie with like a monster in broad daylight, sometimes it's utilized correctly. Like we mentioned in an earlier podcast, we talked about The Host. I really like that sequence quite a lot.
But my Trendlein monster.
Yeah, but it's less scary and more like it's suspenseful. Seeing a giant Paul Bunyan statue come to life and roaring for a second is not scary. It's just a cheap jump scare. And
it really is, yeah.
This movie is guilty of the cheap jump scare more so than the first one. It's like, I mentioned the only gripes that I had about chapter 1 were that a lot of the movie is structured around gags. It's set up around a series of events where characters are put into a scenario that puts them at the mercy of a jump scare, and subsequently the audience is at the mercy of a jump scare. And those jump scares are undercut by really loud noises constantly. This movie is that cranked up to 11. It's constant. It's like one scene after another, and after a while, because this movie is so long and disconnected all the time, like it feels, I don't know how to describe it, it just, every single one of these scares removes tension out of the movie. It extracts it. Like, you just never feel like these characters are in danger. You never feel like it's never going to amount to anything. You always feel like they're going to be fine. And I also feel like Pennywise, his powers are a bit confusing in this movie to me. I know what his powers are. I read the book, but I always feel like he can kill these adults at any moment. I always feel like he's always watching. It's always a threat. It's always kind of playing in the background. There was actually all kinds of little Easter eggs in this movie where like the clown is always represented somewhere in the shot. It's always there, but he never kills them. If he wants to remove the threat, it just never tries to remove the threat. Like, there are moments in this movie where, like, genuinely it probably could have done something serious, especially when they're all separated and off on their own.
Oh yeah, I mean, given what we've seen of Pennywise and his abilities, and I haven't read the book in a long time, right? So, but what I've seen in the movie, he should be able to do some serious damage,
especially when they're separated. It's clearly labeled in the first film especially that Pennywise is weakened when they're together.
Exactly. He's weakened when they're together, and that's how he gets them when they're apart. And there's a big chunk of this movie where they're all apart from one another.
Yes.
And yet, shoulder shrug again.
Yeah, there's basically just writing itself into a hole. It's trying really hard to be as faithful to the source material as possible, while also trying to tell a story all on its own, because it leaves certain things out. Because we mentioned Henry Bowers earlier. The reason why I brought him up is because that character comes back and literally does nothing. He attempts to kill the Losers Club or members of the Losers Club twice and fails, and then you could have cut him right out of the movie. Like, as a threat, he accomplishes nothing. No characters change or evolve from his presence. The worst is Eddie gets stabbed in the face.
And that was a comedic scene, too. It should have been a horrifying scene, and yet they made it funny.
Absolutely. Another example, when Eddie is going for his totem, which is his puffer, he is led down into the basement for reasons. Shoulder shrug. I don't know why.
Oh, I think he heard his mother calling or something.
Yeah, something stupid like that. And it's just like, why would you fall for that? You know that's not the case.
You know that's
also,
not
his
real.
mother passed away, so why are you listening to that? Just don't go there.
Well, it's fear. It's illogical.
I guess. And then so he goes into the basement, and then basically the leper from the first film appears and barfs all over his face, and then it plays the most jarring pop song they possibly could play, and it felt like it was ripped right out of Deadpool.
And that's not what I was there for. No. I love Deadpool, but I wasn't there for Deadpool.
I don't want to laugh during that scene.
No.
I want to be revolted. I want to be quiver in fear. Like, this is a horror film.
Absolutely. And it just didn't feel like that at several points. And again, that just disrupts the flow of the movie.
Yeah.
Makes me aware that I'm watching a movie.
It's genre bending is what it is, and not in a good way. Normally when I say genre bending, I commend ambition. Not in this movie, because it really doesn't know what the hell it's doing constantly. Like, it's shifting and molding. Like, okay, for example, something that I commend it for attempting to do, and it's actually a really effective sequence, is James McAvoy, who plays Bill, is meeting with Mike, and the Old Spice guy, who does a really good job, actually.
Really good job, yeah.
And they actually commit to the ritual of chud, which sounds ridiculous when it comes out of your mouth, because it is. The ritual of chud is basically a deterrent or a means of understanding the creature, Pennywise, or it. Which is a cosmic Lovecraftian monster that is a forever battle against a giant space turtle that has the world on its back. And the
super Terry Pratchett vibes there.
Yeah, it's very strange. And something else to note, and this is something that's important because it's something that's not present in either of these movies. We mentioned the turtle before. In the books, it's described that the turtle is actually the thing that's protecting the kids against the creature, it.
Oh.
So basically Stephen King was fully aware that if this creature has all these powers, it should be able to kill them at any moment, right? No, because they're being protected by Maturin the turtle.
Well, it explains why there are any children in Derry at all.
That's right. The turtle is a deterrent or a deflector against the creature. It's light versus dark, where the turtle is not present in this movie. And trust me, I understand not wanting to put a giant space turtle in your movie. That probably wouldn't sit well with the audience. But
I would have been amused.
But at least it's something that explains some of the mishaps in the film. Okay, so the ritual of chud scene is actually very well done because it shows like the cometh of the creature via like a space comet, and it's like super trippy and weird. Again,
cometh. What?
Yeah, it's well done because it shows like when the creature violently lands, the Native Americans are assaulted viciously by this shape-shifting, horrifying monster, and it's like turning into like all these otherworldly creatures and a giant raven and crow, which I think is a callback to the book, and it's really well done. But then they just never bring it back up again. The ritual of chud is why they're collecting those totems, but it inevitably fails, of course.
Of course, because why would it work? Rituals. You do one thing wrong and that's it. Everything explodes.
Yeah, again, the reason why I brought that scene up is because that's a science fiction scene.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a really cool science fiction scene, but it's something totally separate from the rest of the vibes of the movie.
It's bringing in sci-fi to horror.
Yeah.
And it's not a sci-fi horror movie.
Yeah, it's very strange.
It is very strange.
And so is the book. So it's like, it's really hard to talk about this.
It is.
I feel like our review of this is just as disjointed as the movie.
Because we just don't know where to go with this.
Because the movie doesn't know where to go.
It's
so confusing. And so, okay.
So the one scene that I did like a lot.
Ooh, I was going to ask you this.
Yes.
This is good timing.
One scene that I did really like was the Hall of Mirrors.
I agree. It's probably one of the only scenes in the movie that functions as a horror scene.
Yeah. Essentially, Bill, James McAvoy's character, is trying to save a child who's being hunted by Pennywise. And this child goes into a fun house and naturally goes into the Hall of Mirrors. And so James McAvoy is going in after him, trying to save him from Pennywise, who's in the fun house as well. Right at the climax, James McAvoy and the child are separated by one of the walls, the plexiglass walls, and Pennywise and the child are separated by one of those walls. And Bill is trying so hard to get through that plexiglass to save that kid who's absolutely terrified because there's this demonic clown slamming its face into the plexiglass.
That's the part that makes it scary.
That was scary.
Pennywise laughing maniacally while smashing its face into the glass.
With a mouthful of giant, or really thin razor teeth.
It's so well done.
So well done. And, of course, Bill fails. Child gets eaten.
And it's horrifying.
It is horrifying.
It sets a tone and establishes an aggression in the character that we never saw before. And it's commending the performance of Bill Skarsgård.
Oh, yeah.
Because basically he channels something in this movie that I thought was very impressive in a way. So there's a chapter in the book that focuses entirely on the perspective of the creature, it. And it's almost written, it feels like it's written by like a 6-year-old. The creature is very juvenile and very like minimalist in the way it thinks. It's an entity that it has a very like purely driven singular intent. It wants to feed, and it will go to any lengths to do that. And I think Bill Skarsgård channels that. There's almost like a playfulness to the way, a very sing-song playfulness to the way he handles this performance. Like his portrayal of Pennywise almost feels childlike in a way, but like a child who isn't disciplined properly almost.
Yeah, right up until it wants to eat you, and then it's just the monster.
Yeah.
But it reminds me of the scene earlier in the movie with the little girl. So there's a little girl at the sporting event, and she goes under the bleachers following a red balloon.
Yes.
And she finds Pennywise, and Pennywise is like, come closer, and the child's like, no, you're scary looking, and she's got this red birthmark on her face.
She's saying what the audience is saying. It's like,
exactly.
No one would go anywhere near that
like
clown.
No. And then Pennywise starts crying. And you actually feel a little bad because he's like, no one wants to play with me because of the way I look. And of course, that hooks the girl in. And so she gets eaten. Like, just without giving all of the spoilers away.
The creature played on the psychology of the little girl to attain what it wanted. And that performance in that sequence, again, that's another effective horror scene. This movie
Absolutely.
Isn't without its gems. Like,
it does have a few in there that are
there's some
really
good stuff in here.
Yeah.
It's like the book. There's a lot of really good stuff sprinkled in, and then there's some confusing stuff. And the movie just finds a really difficult time getting its footing portraying that.
Yeah, but now going forward to Beverly, because I love her.
Oh, yeah. Jessica Chastain.
Yeah, she
I have a tiny
did
crush.
a fan.
Not gonna lie.
Sorry,
I got sidetracked.
That's all right. I
on.
expect you give me a movie with Ryan Reynolds or something and we'll get distracted. Anyway, I really loved her character in this.
Yeah.
Because although all of the kids left, with the exception of Mike, left Derry, they didn't leave unscathed. All of them had trauma and scars left over from their altercation with Pennywise. Eddie ends up essentially marrying his mother.
Mm-hmm.
Beverly ends up marrying her father. Abusive, awful man who, she beats up and leaves when he tries to, or actually doesn't try, he does beat her.
Very much mirroring this sequence with her father in the first film.
Absolutely. Her journey is really great.
I really enjoyed it, and I mean, if you saw the trailer for this film, it definitely capitalizes. It's almost like a crying shame that the trailer capitalized off of that sequence in its entirety, because it is very well done. It builds suspense and tension. There are moments that are almost chuckle-worthy, where like you see like Pennywise shifting and moving around in the background and stuff.
As a naked old woman.
Yeah, it's a little funny.
It is a little, again, comedy in a horror movie,
but it's a discomforting funny where like the old lady up until that point is utterly terrifying, because like there's
something wrong with her.
Those wonderful performance notes of like she's breaking in and out of like a human being persona. Like she stops and pauses and in the middle of a sentence and smiles.
Yep, just like Pennywise did at the beginning of the first chapter.
That's right. Like there's all kinds of little subtle things there that are just really well done, making the hair on the back of your neck stand up. But then the scene ends kind of in a very mixed way for me, and it very much summarizes my feelings on every gag in this movie. It's punctuated by a really bad CGI effect.
Yes, the CGI effects in this movie are not
oh my god,
I know there's a couple that haunt you.
They're very bad. The visual effects in this movie are a total mixed bag. There's some good stuff in there, there's some great stuff in there, and there's some terrible stuff in here. Like,
Do you want to talk about Pennywise?
All right. Yeah, we might as well get to this
let's just dive in and get it out of the way.
I need to,
Vent away, Skyler, you have the floor.
I feel like we should get to the climax of this thing, because basically this movie is a series of jump scares with isolated characters for the dumbest reason possible, and then they all meet up together and they have to fight the clown at the end. That's right. This is a 3-hour-long movie about a bunch of adults returning to their hometown to beat up a clown. There
you go. That's what you should have done for the summary, the plot summary. There we are.
You're right.
We didn't do that at the beginning.
Yeah, redact
That's all right.
the summary, and I just said it.
This is there. He just gave you the summary.
Yeah, so the climax leads to a very infamous sequence that is very mixed across the board with even Stephen King fans, where basically the Losers Club commit to the ritual of Chud in the well, like it's basically in the subterranean part of Derry. It's underground. And they successfully commit to the ritual, but then it fails because there's obviously a component that's missing from it, based on the Native American lore that Mike knew about, but no one else did. And Pennywise turns into a giant spider, and the giant spider in question is something that in the book it's portrayed that basically the creature can only be visually represented as a spider because it's the only way that we can perceive it. It's like a Lovecraft monster. In this movie, they're like, well, it turns into a giant spider, but we have to still keep it as a spooky clown because people like spooky clowns. So what do we do? And they're like, I can picture a bunch of people in a meeting just being like, excuse me, sir, spooky clown spider?
Oh, yeah, that
let's
sounds
do
great.
That. You get a raise on Monday. And then and so they just put Pennywise's stupid head on a spider legs, and it's very poorly conceived. There's a lack of imagination that is baffling to me. I really didn't like this effect.
No, and I don't know if that's because the bar was set so low with the mini-series version of...
oh, you mean that big styrofoam monster?
Yeah, like the bar was so low. It's like, oh, as long as we do better than that, it should be fine.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it is better than like going cow tipping with a giant plastic monster and pushing it over and stabbing it.
Or like spider tipping?
Whatever. It was stupid. And it's stupid in this movie too. I mean, it's more effective. But that's not saying much. It's more effective than a giant plastic monster. That's what I'm saying. That's not a compliment.
No, it really...
My cat is more threatening than a giant plastic monster. Poor
see,
there he is.
You had to wake up the beast, didn't you?
I kind of upset him. Anyway, regardless, the climax of this movie, again, was a head scratcher for me because it doesn't feel like a horror film. It feels very much like, almost like it's on a spectacle level not too dissimilar from like a Godzilla or even like a Marvel film or something. It feels big, grandiose, too big for it to be grounded in any sort of realms of like horror. Like horror can be big, but this movie just keeps escalating and escalating and escalating to a point where like it just feels like a big mess and it doesn't know what it wants to be. There are singular moments that really work, but like as a whole, it doesn't.
No, this movie had potential. It had potential to be really good, but in the end, it was just too broken. It wasn't fluid enough for me to really get immersed in. I think that's what I'm walking away with from this one.
The thing I like the most about this movie actually has nothing to do with any genre cinema at all. It's characters. I love these characters.
The character journeys were the best part of this.
Richie's especially, like, I actually got choked up at the end because, like, Richie's reaction to Eddie dying. Now, that speaks to what we mentioned earlier about Richie's developments in this movie, which is something I thought that was kind of the heart of the movie in a lot of ways, where it's revealed that Richie is gay and struggling with his sexuality. And there's a lot of really tender moments where he's wrestling with his feelings for one of the other members of the Losers Club. And the worst part about it is it's very tragic that he doesn't get to actually reveal those feelings to this person because Eddie is killed off at the end of the film,
which I feel like is something that's done a lot in movies and cinema where they have homosexual characters, is that they die, or the love interest of that homosexual character dies, and it's kind of sad. And
because you're rooting for them and you just
want them to be happy.
And like Richie is such a well-developed character, and all these characters are like, they're all so wonderful, and that's why this is such a difficult movie to review, because you want it to be good so bad, because there's a lot of good foundational blocks here. Like, there are good conceptual elements of this film that could be really good to tell a story. There are great characters here, but it basically just makes sort of like a stew with a few ingredients that it doesn't need, essentially.
Yeah, they included moments that I feel could have been left out, and then they left out moments that could have been included.
Yeah, it's very strange. There are whole characters just taken right out of this.
Yeah, Bill's wife, I guess.
Bill's wife, yeah.
Doesn't show up, whereas in the book she does.
Beverly's husband.
Beverly's husband doesn't show up in the movie, but does.
Yeah, Henry Bowers is reduced down to like a footnote.
A comedic footnote, really?
Yeah, exactly. A mullet joke, really.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely a mullet joke.
Yeah. So that kind of in a weird way summarizes all of our feelings on this.
We're kind of all over the board on this one, and apologies, but this movie was kind of all over the board.
It's hard to talk about this one because it quite literally doesn't have a focus or a drive. It is a series of just disjointed events that are trying to elicit some sort of an emotional scare out of you or an emotional response, but it's a confusing mess. And which is a shame because the first film is very effective and very entertaining. And I feel like there are entertaining things in this film too. It's just not the kind of movie that, for example, like the first film, the chapter 1, you could throw that on and you can watch that whenever if you're a horror fan. You could just throw that on and it's super entertaining and odds are you'll be roped in. This is not one of those kinds of movies because of its length and pacing, because it's disconnected and disjointed. It's not something that you can easily just jump into. It does wrap up nicely. There's a good conclusion to this, and I think they do the best that they can with the mess that they have. But overall, it's a less effective film than the first.
Yeah. So with that in mind, why don't we launch into the scores?
Yeah, let's get to the numbers.
All right.
So I think I went first the last time.
I think so. So It Chapter 2 could have been better than it was, not as good as the first one. I award 7.5.
I'm going to go lower than you on this one. This one was a disappointment for me on a lot of levels because I was genuinely excited about this, but as stated, it's just not as effective as the first one, and it doesn't stand on its own 2 feet. And it's a giant mess. I'm going to go with a 6.5 for It Chapter 2.
Boom.
Yeah. So we're averaging out at a 7 for this one.
Yeah.
Which is, passable entertainment, but not the best.
Yeah, no, unfortunately not. So yeah, that concludes episode 5. And it was brought to our attention that we do a lot of, well, we've only done horror movies so far.
For the most part, yeah.
We're going to be changing that up because we're not doing it deliberately. We just really like horror movies.
Yeah, sorry about that, folks. It's an instinct of ours. We love this genre, and we've just been picking movies that kind of appeal to our sensibilities. And then also on top of that, there just have been a lot of new horror films.
There've been a lot of releases lately.
Yeah.
That said, we are going to be doing the next one on something different. I'm not going to say more than that, but something different.
Yeah, going forward for the next little while, we're probably going to deviate a little bit away from horror for a bit.
With the exception of end of October, which, spooky month.
Yeah, that's true.
We have something special lined up that we think you're going to like. So, if you haven't already, follow us on Facebook, Eldritch Creative. If you've got Instagram and want to see some interesting photos, we've got our Instagram account at eldritch.creative. And Twitter, which totally is in use and has posts all the time, at Eldritch Create.
Was that sarcasm?
It might be.
Excellent.
I hate Twitter.
I don't like it either. I'm more of an Instagram guy.
I like Instagram.
Yeah.
We got some fun photos on there.
Yeah.
Anyway, but thanks for tuning in, guys.
Yeah.
And, your support means a lot to us. If you guys have any suggestions for movies to talk about that you want us to review, if you have any remake rumbles, which, hopefully you listened to the last episode and can give us some feedback on that. Any ideas for that? Hit us up, post a comment, let us know. And I guess we'll see you next time.
Yeah, see you next time, everyone.
All right, thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.